Hello, everyone. I'm David Schwartz. I'm partner in Thompson Hine's International Trade Practice Group, and I serve as its practice group leader. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. This is the first in a series of webinars that Thompson Hine will be presenting, examining the transition from President Trump to President-elect Biden and assessing that transition's impact on our country and on our regulatory policies. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items to address. Today's program is being recorded, and we will send a link to all attendees within 48 hours of today's presentation. If you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to use the question box located in the control panel on the right side of your screen to submit questions. We will answer as many of the questions as we can at the end of the webinar. We'll be offering CLE credit for today's webinar. Please be sure to fill out and return the webinar affirmation form that can be found in the handout section of the control panel located on the right-hand side of your screen. The form provides instructions as to where to send the completed form. You will need a tracking code, which I'll announce at the end of the program. In the handout panel, you can also download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and the web bios of today's presenters. Again, thank you for your interest. And if you have any questions as we go along, please use the question box. I am David Schwartz, and I am delighted to introduce my colleague, Joyce Rodriguez, who's an associate in Thompson Hine's International Trade Group, who will be presenting with me today. Joyce, say hello to the audience.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here.
Today, we're going to be talking about the transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration and its impact on trade policy. I've called it the Trump transformation to the Biden restoration. We'll find out. First, we're going to look into Trump's trade views and see how that transformed decades of US trade policy. We're going to discuss exactly what policies President Trump implemented during his 4 years as president. We'll then pivot to President-elect Biden and consider his trade views and prognosticate as best we can, based on what little information has been made available to us, on how President-elect Biden will respond to the trade policies currently in place, whether he's going to return or restore the multilateral free trade approach that had been popular for decades before President Trump, whether he'll continue President Trump's policies, or whether he'll use a hybrid approach. Let's first take a look at President Trump's trade views. From the 2016 campaign, we know that President Trump emphasized three major issues: taxes, immigration, and trade. We're all familiar with his mantra that NAFTA is a huge disaster. Trump has always been interested in trade. He was writing about it back in the 80s when he was publishing books. I think the reason why trade appealed to him at such a personal level is because trade reflects how he views both business and how he views life. It's a zero-sum game. They're winners and they're losers. For President Trump, he scores trade exclusively on trading goods, on manufacturing. He doesn't focus at all in trade and services. He keeps score bilaterally based on the goods trade balance. He dislikes multilateralism or plurilateralism, trade agreements involving more than two parties or negotiations involving more than two parties, because quite simply, it's hard to keep score. You don't know who's winning or who's losing. So how did President Trump's views on trade affect US trade policy? Well, I think it's safe to say that President Trump overhauled trade policy. based on his views. And he was able to do it because he found a kindred spirit in US Trade Representative Bob Lighthizer. Lighthizer is a longtime Washington insider. He worked at the USTR, he worked in Congress, and for more than 30 years before he became USTR, he was representing domestic industries in trade remedy cases. In short, Lighthizer knows the trade laws, knows the bureaucracy, and knows Congress. While it may be fair to say that Lighthizer has a more sophisticated view of trade policy than President Trump, he shared many of the same objectives as President Trump. They both wanted to rebalance trade to further support US manufacturing, lower dependence on imported goods, and reshore US manufacturing. Together, they adopted a bilateral or unilateral strategy. The US was going to go at it alone on trade policy. Together, they largely focused on phased deals with individual companies that did not require congressional approval. They were highly critical of multilateral and plurilateral arrangements like the NAFTA, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the World Trade Organization. They used tariffs to coax other countries to the negotiation table, and they freely issued executive orders to carry out trade policy. So how did these policies affect trade relations? Well, these policies triggered a large number of trade negotiations because the tariff wars that were started with the US and other countries forced other countries to the negotiation table. And here you have a list of negotiations that were either completed or that are pending. We tweaked the US-Korean Free Trade Agreement. We revised the NAFTA, changing its name to the USMCA. We negotiated a phase one deal with China. We negotiated a phase one deal with Japan. And we currently have 3 pending negotiations with India, the UK, and Kenya. Another impact from President Trump's trade policies is how it affected our trade relations and our status on the global trade stage. We withdrew from many activities where we were once leading. On his 3rd day in office, President Trump withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. With the World Trade Organization, Lighthizer and Trump quickly withdrew support of the dispute settlement system, arguing that it needed reform. And by arguing that it needed reform, the US pulling its support effectively disabled the dispute settlement body. And most recently, even though almost everyone in the WTO membership supported the Director General nominee from Nigeria, the US supported the other candidate from Korea. As you all well know, the US pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal back in 2018. We formally withdrew from the Paris Climate Accords in November of 2020. And during the pandemic, we announced that we would be withdrawing from the World Health Organization effective July 6, 2021. Here's a list of the various tariff actions that the Trump administration took during the past 4 years to coax other countries to open their markets to US goods or to lower their tariffs on US goods. These Section 232 and Section 301 investigations that are listed were all self-initiated by the US government to force negotiations. None of them were requested by a domestic industry. The generalized system of preferences, which provides duty-free benefits to developing countries, was removed from these countries listed, Thailand, India, and Turkey, in order to obtain concessions for US goods. these talks are still ongoing. The Digital Services Tax Section 301 investigations, the first one, which was initially launched in 2019 against France and expanded this past year to cover 9 other countries in the EU, largely resulted in affirmative findings. But interestingly, the Trump administration decided not to take any actions. These delays will allow the Biden trade team to act, if at all, in response. There was also recently a Section 301 investigation affirmative finding on Vietnam's currency practices that was issued, but again, no action was taken. And word is Vietnam and the United States are negotiating a settlement on that, and that's something that will carry over, it's expected to carry over into the Biden administration. There is a pending Section 301 investigation concerning Vietnam's timber trade, and that's still ongoing, but the understanding is that will be folded into the negotiations that have been launched concerning Vietnam's currency practices. I'm now going to pass the baton to my colleague Joyce to continue the discussion.
Thank you, David. It really is a pleasure to be here. Thank you for everyone that is attending, for tuning in. It really is a pleasure to talk to you all about these significant changes we've seen with U.S. trade policy these past 4 years. We really can't underestimate their impact on the next 4 years and on Biden administration's trade policy. And I think, David, your characterization of Trump's trade policy as an overhaul is quite spot on. You just talked a little bit about how he used tariffs unilaterally. He also relied heavily on executive action and agencies, particularly Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security, Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, the Defense Department and State Department as well, to really push through trade policy based on national security reasons, specifically through tools, sanctions, export controls, and foreign investment review, which are the 3 topics that I'll be focusing my presentation on. This slide is my attempt to disentangle the web of sanctions, export controls, and foreign investment tactics that the Trump administration has taken with the example of getting tough on China. First and foremost, of course, are sanctions and export controls with respect to Hong Kong. He revoked the Hong Kong's special trading status with the United States, such that now all export controls applicable to China are also applicable to Hong Kong. And with the Hong Kong normalization executive order, in practice, really implemented new secondary sanctions with respect to Hong Kong, really targeting non-U.S. persons that are supporting this type of conduct, this breach of Hong Kong's autonomy in China. He has also moved sanctions and export controls toward a new kind of circle of companies, communist military companies, and also expanded controls on military end uses. Specifically, he sanctioned Chinese firms that are thought to be enabling the Chinese military. A lot of impact there with respect to U.S. investments, particularly in these companies. The Department of Defense has put out a list of these companies, and it's a wide range of companies, and also expanded the military end use and user rules for China, but also for Russia and Venezuela, resulting in a lot more export control authority and more end uses that are going to be subject to licensing requirements. Trump also has focused controls on U.S. Semiconductor technology and really has honed in on information and communication technology threats. For the most part, this has also targeted China. This resulted in adding many or most of Huawei affiliated entities to the entity list, effectively barring all exports, re-exports, and in-country transfers of items to these entities. And when that wasn't enough, also expanded the direct product rule, really making more items subject to the EAR, not just exports, re-exports, but also with respect to transactions involving Huawei entities. And finally, also through a new executive order, provided interagency authority to unwind these types of technologies and transactions. Just last week, these regulations came in, targeting foreign adversaries, and this will not only target this type of information communication technology for sensitive personal data on China, but also Russia and Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro made it to the list as well. And finally, there has been a move towards or a focus on forced labor, human rights abuses, and government corruption. We definitely saw that with focus on the Xinjiang region, with sanctions on specific officials of the region that are responsible for forced labor and other human rights abuses, and also a broad executive order on the GLOMAG sanctions that target human rights abuses and government corruption, which has designated over 240 individuals and entities to that list. Next slide, please. Back one slide. Thank you. Yes, we cannot skip over sanctions because this is definitely another area specifically that the Trump administration really focused on, particularly implementing new sanctions regimes and also significantly expanding existing sanctions regimes. With new sanctions, we saw them against Nicaragua, targeting the Ortega regime, Syria, targeting Turkey's military action in northeastern Syria, Mali related to violations of the ceasefire arrangements in the region and also other terrorist activity. And finally, as I mentioned, Hong Kong. Most of these new sanctions really did target anti-democratic actions within these countries, as well as other malign or aggressive activities. In addition to new sanctions, definitely expanded existing sanctions. Venezuela previously only targeted some drug trafficking efforts and counterterrorism as well, but now has broadened those sanctions to sectoral sanctions, very similar to the sanctions against Russia, targeting financial, oil, defense, and intelligence sectors, particularly in response to the Maduro regime's anti-democratic and human rights abuses efforts in Venezuela. Of course, we saw the rollback of certain Obama normalization efforts with Cuba. Most significantly is the development of the Cuba restricted list, which in effect really rolls back a lot of the authorizations that were in the sanctions regulations, prohibiting these types of transactions with very large state-owned companies that essentially render these authorizations unusable. Probably most popularly failed to suspend Title III of the Helms-Burton Act, which allowed U.S. persons to file lawsuits claiming their expropriated property that was taken by the Cuban government, and instituting these lawsuits against third-party and third-country companies in the United States. And just last week added them back onto the state sponsors of terrorism list. We also saw significant expansions through the Countering America's Adversaries through Sanctions Act, or CAFTA, really just emboldening the sanctions against Russia, North Korea, and Iran. With respect to Russia, we saw mandatory sanctions for the first time in legislation targeting new debt, corruption, security, and its defense and intelligence sectors, which now includes some sanctions against a Turkish company. Added to that Section 231 catalyst. In North Korea, we saw a similar expansion of sanctions in various economic sectors, and it was earlier on in 2017 added to the state sponsor of terrorism list. And finally, of course, probably the most significant change in sanctions regimes due to the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA, all sanctions related to nuclear proliferation, mostly secondary sanctions were reimposed. And in addition to that, the sanctions were also expanded to various economic sectors: construction, mining, textile, you name it. There's probably a targeted Iran sanctions regime against it. And of course, in response to various malign activities throughout the region, and most recently also targeting conventional arms in Iran. Next slide, please. Back one slide. There you go. Yeah, so David and I think we agreed on this portion. We're going to move toward Trump's trade enforcement trends, and that really how I can sum up Trump's point of view here is the bigger is better, more is better. Sanctions, we saw the biggest increase in sanctions programs, as I just mentioned. Export controls, a significant number of expansion on items subject to the EAR, the export administration regulations, but also just more authority and tools to meet these foreign policy and trade policy goals. And I'll talk briefly about it more at the end of this section, but it's definitely worth noting that this was the biggest expansion ever of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States authority to review foreign investments in the United States for national security reasons. And also an interesting trend was that, sanctions export controls were targeting global and publicly traded companies, which is something that we really hadn't seen prior to the Trump administration. Next slide, please. And something else too, one slide back, please. Thank you. These all kind of look a little bit the same, so I'll fly through these. But I really just wanted to show that, the new authority and new tools that are available. I listed a few of them, but also the melding of these three tools of sanctions, export controls, and foreign investment reviewed together was really a unique strategy by this administration. We definitely saw record-breaking designations, with just Iran just snapping back or reimposing those secondary sanctions. We saw 700 designations to the specially designated nationals and blocked entity lists in one day. This number has doubled previous administrations with over 1,000 designations to the SCM list every year. And also, as I mentioned, new types of designees like large Russian companies, Rusal Gas Group, and famously PDVSA, the state-owned oil company in Venezuela. Next slide. Same thing with export controls. Previous slide, please. We also saw, as I mentioned, the expansion of the direct products rule, a new commerce authority, which we're looking to dig into further and figure out what the parameters of those are and will be. And something that I didn't mention before is really focusing on new emerging and foundational technologies controls in the United States and elsewhere in terms of increasing U.S. competitiveness in technology. These expansion of export controls for new reasons, or at least reasons that hadn't been the target of, or the only target of export controls: human rights abuses, forced labor, and even territorial disputes in the South China Sea. And again, targeting large publicly traded companies. Next slide, please. And yeah, I did want to take a quick moment to talk about this because it is the biggest review authority ever granted to CFIUS through the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act of 2018 to include review authority over passive minority position investments in U.S. businesses involving critical technologies, critical infrastructure, and sensitive personal data of U.S. citizens, and also gave CFIUS jurisdiction over certain purchases or leases of U.S. real estate near sensitive facilities. And that's important not just for bad actors, quote unquote, but also for our allies and foreign country investors in the United States. This was also a topic of the Secure and Trusted Communications Network Act targeting telecom equipment. This changes as well government contracts issues and prohibited the use of federal funds and subsidies from the purchase of communications equipment from companies posing any sort of national security risk. This was also a new focus of the administration. Next slide, please.
Joyce, I'll handle this slide. As a trade remedy lawyer, I can definitely attest that bigger is better when it comes to trade remedies. During the Trump administration, we had our largest increase ever in trade remedy cases filed this past year, in no small part because the Trump administration itself, self-initiated, brought itself trade remedy cases rather than relying on the domestic industries to bring the cases. We also saw the Trump administration take advantage of a new tool available to the government to self-initiate anti-circumvention inquiries based on U.S. import data. For those of you who don't follow trade remedy litigation, anti-circumvention inquiries determine whether or not products are covered by scopes of existing trade remedy orders or not. As a result, because of the Trump administration's involvement in self-initiating trade remedy cases and these anti-circumvention inquiries, we saw a significant uptick in trade cases. Now let's turn to President-elect Joe Biden and discuss his trade views. He's been in government for a very long time, and it's safe to say his views have clearly changed over time, even though the changes were only noticeable in the last few years. As many of you know, President-elect Biden became a senator, a U.S. senator at the age of 29, and he quickly became involved in foreign relations issues, and trade's a big part of foreign relations. He soon became part of the bipartisan consensus, which supports multilateral free trade and supports the U.S. global trade leadership. He's of the view that free trade should be used as a tool to promote U.S. interests abroad and to promote U.S. leadership abroad. After President-elect Biden left the Senate and became former President Obama's vice president, he championed the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and he continued what many presidents had done previously, engage China in trade. When China acceded to the World Trade Organization in 2001, it was the hope of many existing WTO members, including the United States, that this would open up China as a market, and it would convince China to adopt laws and regulations that would make it easier to do business with China. Since President Trump was elected in 2016, and since the campaign, we've seen a notable shift in President-elect Biden's views on trade policy. He now has made it clear that trade must support domestic aims. There's no better way of showing of how his views have changed in how he is now championing Trump trade policies that were popular in the Rust Belt states. The blue wall, as it turns out, for President-elect Biden in the election, because he was able to flip a few states that helped him win election. But those states are concerned about manufacturing. And you'll see that President-elect Biden's tone has shifted to focus less on free trade for free trade's sake and focus more on how will trade benefit U.S. manufacturing and the U.S. workers. Bob Lighthizer appeared on Fox News yesterday and was excited to say that President-elect Biden will be continuing a significant trade policy shift that Lighthizer and Trump introduced the past 4 years. And that is, rather than engaging China on trade, the popular bipartisan consensus now is to confront China on trade. And President-elect Biden has made that clear in interviews that he intends to carry out that Trump administration trade policy. In support of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, President-elect Biden has made it clear that he is going to advocate to address labor and environmental issues in existing and future free trade agreements and in other fora, in other trade negotiations and trade discussions. Most of all, President-elect Biden has emphasized that it's very important that the U.S. restore its reputation as a leader on trade policy issues, and that it becomes more involved with its allies in addressing trade policy issues. So what can we expect from President-elect Joe Biden? Because of the pandemic and because of his concern over the post-pandemic economy, trade will necessarily become a back burner issue, unlike its emphasis during the Trump administration. President-elect Biden will be focused on all sorts of initiatives that will help the U.S. worker. You're going to be hearing that a lot. We're going to be hearing about how trade policy can help the U.S. worker. So any steps that President-elect Biden takes on the economy, healthcare, education, infrastructure, clean energy initiatives will all be focused on the U.S. worker, and the same is true for his trade policy. He's also stated in interviews that he does not plan to complete any new trade agreement until major investments are made in U.S. workers and infrastructure. That pretty much sums up for you why trade will be a back burner issue. There will also be a significant change in tone concerning trade policy compared to the Trump administration. President-elect Biden has made it clear that the U.S. government will be less confrontational and more cooperative with allies, with other branches of government, in order to create collective leverage to address trade concerns. His U.S. Trade Representative nominee, Katherine Tai, is a great example of what President-elect Biden wants to achieve in his trade policy. Katherine Tai handled Chinese trade enforcement at the USTR. She speaks Mandarin Chinese. And when she moved over to Congress, where she's now the chief trade counsel, the House Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee, she has made it clear in interviews since her nomination that she will focus on worker-centric trade policies using a collaborative approach with all stakeholders. It should be mentioned that Katherine Tai was instrumental in introducing labor enforcement mechanisms in the USMCA. Congress was able to get the deal that had been in place opened up again to strengthen labor enforcement mechanisms. And again, that supports the Biden-Tai approach to support the U.S. worker. President-elect Biden has talked about embracing multilateralism. What does that mean? Well, in any number of interviews, he has said that he wants to team up with our allies to confront China over market access issues and tech transfer and intellectual property protection practices. He plans to return to the Paris Climate Accords immediately, probably sometime this week via executive order, and will likely focus on incorporating climate change provisions in existing and future FTA's environmental chapters. He also plans this week to rejoin the World Health Organization. Now, you would probably ask yourself, why does the World Health Organization have anything to do with trade? Well, during the pandemic, we've learned that it's important to work together to address the trade cross-border of PPE, vaccines, and other medical supplies. It is also likely that he will engage the European Union to negotiate existing trade disputes, primarily the Airbus-Boeing aircraft subsidy dispute. In fact, last week, the EU's trade ministers, Sabine Wayon, expressed hope that in the first 6 months of the Biden administration, that they'll be able to sit down and negotiate away this dispute that's been around for more than a dozen years. She also said she hopes that the Biden administration will be able to sit down with not only the EU, but with Japan and other allies to talk about WTO reform. She mentioned that this WTO reform would not only address how they can fix the dispute settlement process, but also how to manage China's distorting business practices. And she said that it'd be a conciliatory gesture on the part of the Biden administration if it would support the Nigerian Director General nominee, who has most, if not all, of consensus support from the WTO, so that the WTO will no longer be without a leader. She said if the Biden administration takes that first step, then the WTO membership will forgive and forget what has happened in the past few years. Finally, President-elect Biden has mentioned that he'd be open to joining the successor to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, but he mentioned he would only do so if he could negotiate changes first. That alone may be a heavy lift with the current the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership signatories. So what will President-elect Biden do specifically concerning imports? He's pledged to significantly expand Buy American requirements for U.S. government procurement and infrastructure projects, calling for tighter domestic content rules and limits on the use of waivers. He's also pledged that all future trade negotiations will include input from labor and environmental leaders. It's unclear whether that pledge applies to the pending U.S., UK, and U.S.-Kenya free trade agreements. It's also unclear how successful President-elect Biden will be in renegotiating existing free trade agreements like the USMCA and the CPTPP. The other parties, the other signatories, may be unwilling to renegotiate at this stage. President-elect Biden has stated that Section 301 tariffs will remain in place for now until a review of the Phase 1 deal with China occurs, and until he can also consult with our allies like Japan, South Korea, and the EU in order to develop a coherent strategy to confront China on trade issues. It appears that any Section 301 tariff product exclusion process that occurs during the Biden administration will be much more transparent with explanations for denials of product exclusion requests. I believe that the Section 232 tariffs on aluminum and steel imports will likely be removed from those countries, if they haven't already been removed, from those countries that Biden considers critical in his efforts to reassert U.S. global trade leadership and in order to confront China. I'll now hand back the presentation to Joyce.
Thank you, David. I think you're absolutely right that Biden's response to Trump's policies will certainly focus on the economy first. We'll definitely see a change in tone. The multilateral approach will be the umbrella approach of most of these foreign policy tools for sanctions, export controls, and foreign investment review authority, but also a more targeted approach with more specific end goals for each of these tools, and potentially reining in on some, but definitely not all, expansions of authority. We don't expect a significant reversal of export control authority or commerce authority, nor CFIUS review authority to unwind foreign investment deals. We do think that there will be a different approach to these issues, but the focus will be U.S. competition in tech, and as David mentioned, staying tough on China. CFIUS review, the approach again will change, but only to be more discreet and weary of how this, how it affects our allies that are trying to invest in the United States. The focus will continue to be on China and sanctioned countries, emerging and foundational technologies, telecommunications equipment, and U.S. data privacy, semiconductors, critical technology and infrastructure. And we definitely expect that these tools will be used together to meet broader foreign policy goals, but not to the extent that the Trump administration has used them, and they'll be reined in a little bit. One example of how these will be implemented is with respect to China. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the response, of course, there's significant bipartisan support to be and look tough on China. As David mentioned, this is a change in trade policy views on both sides of the aisle. There will be a new tone. I don't think it'll be as confrontational as it has been, and there will certainly be some reestablishment of bilateral diplomatic engagement between the two countries. And like David mentioned, with generally pushing for labor and environmental precision, but also pushing China to do more with the environment and to do more with respect to the pandemic response. The focus will again be on multilateralism, reinvigorating allies in the region and Europe to exert pressure on China. But with, as I mentioned, a continued focus on making sure that U.S. can compete in significant tech sectors. We don't expect much movement on Trump policies with respect to sanctions, export controls, or foreign investment in scrutiny, except for a change in approach. With respect to more specific policies with China and Huawei in particular, we do expect, like I said, a more multilateral approach. Trade officials may attempt to get some allies on board with this approach as opposed to going at it alone. They'll probably rein in some of that expanded and amended direct product rule, particularly with respect to its extraterritorial effect on its allies, drawing this delicate balance between trying to be tough on China, but also open and willing to engage in its allies around the world. We do not expect the Biden administration to reverse course with respect to Hong Kong. And in fact, we do expect that the Biden administration will continue to focus on human rights abuses and making that a very important part of its trade policy, especially because there is support on both sides of the aisle, and with respect to forced labor issues as well. And we expect that the military end use and user rules for China, Russia, and Venezuela will remain. But we do expect more detail and clarity. And just generally with respect to export controls, a little more buy-in from industry. Like David mentioned, the focus of this administration will be the economy, the U.S. economy. And so engaging key stakeholders in the United States and really understanding how this is impacting our domestic industry will be top of mind for Biden. Next slide, please. And this is going to be a similar approach, I think, to sanctions, but we're not going to see any reversals of major sanctions programs in the near term. There's a couple of exceptions to that. We're thinking Cuba will likely be one of these exceptions, certainly with suspending the Title III of the Helms-Burton Act to not allow those losses to continue, although in effect, I'm not sure that in practice that'll have too much of an effect. But also will likely return to Obama-era travel and remittances to appease some Cuban Americans. But as we know, Biden lost the Florida vote, and Cuban Americans will probably not be for any other changes. So I wouldn't overestimate how many sanctions he will be able to reverse or get support for reversing with respect to Cuba. Of course, the more controversial sanctions, something like the sanctions against international criminal court personnel, we expect that to be reversed or that the authority will just lapse. We expect, again, a continued focus on Iran, North Korea, Syria, and Russia. Again, human rights abuses, forced labor, and certainly nuclear and ballistic missile proliferation. In the medium to longer term, we think that Biden's approach to Russia will be tougher. So it will potentially increase, especially with respect to focusing on corruption and human rights abuses. But that will be, of course, in tension with other foreign policy goals with Russia, particularly the JCPOA, and with the allies in Europe on other issues that might not be as popular, like the pipeline related sanctions. North Korea will likely increase. Syria will continue to increase. And Venezuela, we're not exactly sure what's going to happen with Venezuela. This remains to be seen. I assume that there would be a more comprehensive approach to Latin America, particularly with Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. But we do expect some change in diplomacy with those countries. And then, as an example, of course, we wanted to focus on Iran. Next slide, please. The million-dollar question, right? Whether or not the U.S. will re-enter the JCPOA, and whether or not Iran sanctions will remain as they have in the past. There's definitely bipartisan support for Iran sanctions and staying tough on Iran. It's not 2016, right? The U.S. relationship with Iran is different, definitely now. Of course, Biden would disagree that the Iran deal was, quote, one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into. A Trump quote, and that withdrawal from the JCPOA was really a mistake and didn't produce the results. The maximum pressure campaign against Iran didn't really bring Iran to the table. Arguably, and certainly what Biden's view would be, it pushed it further and further away. So I think a new tone will be in place for sure, less maximum pressure, more compliance pressure. Biden has been quoted to say that, if Iran returns to strict compliance with the nuclear deal, the U.S. would rejoin it, especially as a starting point for follow-on negotiations. So, with respect to there's certainly some urgency here for early signaling. In Iran, the June presidential elections will probably lead to early signaling by the Biden administration on JCPOA compliance. A few areas of opportunity for Biden is maybe not reversing sanctions, but of course he can definitely lower the designations or stop designations with respect to nuclear-related programs to the SDN list. And U.S. has been criticized heavily by human rights NGOs with respect to the impact of U.S. sanctions on Iran's ability to respond adequately to the COVID-19. So that's another area that we might see some change with respect to reversal or at least lessening of sanctions on Iran in the near term. Generally, of course, as David mentioned, and that we keep kind of pounding, is this: the U.S. will have to do a lot of work in repairing its relationships with the EU and the other JCPOA partners like Russia to pressure Iran. Iran has responded with a maximum resistance campaign, but it's inevitably true that the impact that sanctions have had on the Iranian economy have been extreme. In the longer term, this is a trust game. Building trust with Iran and leveraging Trump's policies will probably, keep going in the medium to longer term and move towards a carrot and stick approach rather than a stick and stick and stick approach, with the goal of eventually expanding JCPOA negotiations to make the deal more permanent or to include other issues that many in the region and in Congress think were left out of that original deal. Next slide. And then finally, we skipped over one of my slides, and it was really just focusing on, bigger penalties by the U.S. Department of Justice in response to sanctions and export controls violations, upwards of $1 billion, against targeting large telecom companies, targeting large European banks. The cases that I put on there were related to ZTE, Société Générale, and Standard Chartered Bank, and a recent indictment of individuals involved in a North Korea sanctions violation scheme. We don't expect those types of cases to stop, but again, we do expect a more tempered and strategic use of the SDN list designations and just these bans as part of a more cohesive trade policy with respect to each country, less of a knee-jerk kind of reaction or tit for tat, and more of a targeted approach to obtain very specific results. The Biden administration will continue to target bad actors with respect to sanctions and export controls in order to really limit or block them from accessing U.S. markets and U.S. financial systems. And I'll turn it back to David for the remaining of the presentation to talk about more specifically the trade enforcement and trade remedies.
Thank you, Joyce. I simply want to point out that it's highly unlikely that the Biden administration will self-initiate trade remedy cases or go whole hog into self-initiating circumvention inquiries for fear of offending our trade allies. He does not want to incur the wrath of our allies. If domestic industries want to bring these cases, then that's up to them. But I don't see the Biden administration self-initiating any trade cases at a time when he's trying to repair relationships with them so that they'll team up with them to address global trade policies. That formally ends our presentation. I think we have time answer maybe one or two questions that have been sent to us. But before I get to the questions, now's the time that I'll provide you the CLE credit information that you need. The CLE credit tracking code is 2020 election. Again, that tracking code is 2020 election. And now I am checking to see what questions we received. Here's one, Joyce, that I think is best suited for you. Will Biden double down on sanctions against Hong Kong?
Thank you, David. That's a great question. We do think that, as we mentioned, Biden will have a focus on staying tough on China, and with more and more focus on forced labor issues, human rights issues, corruption. We don't necessarily think that he will double down on sanctions, but he will not be reversing. It's very unlikely that he'll be reversing the Hong Kong status right now with respect to export controls and sanctions, and will likely continue to sanction companies, individuals that are pushing China or supporting China in breaching Hong Kong's autonomy. And I don't think that'll be top of mind in terms of China policy, but it will definitely not change necessarily in the near term.
Thank you, Joyce. I think we have time for one more question, and this is one that I can field. Do you think that the MTB or the GSP, the Miscellaneous Tariff Bill, or the Generalized System of Preferences will be renewed early on in the Biden administration? Both expired at the end of last year. I think that the MTB has every chance of being renewed because, as many people may know who follow the MTB, a few years ago, it was not renewed because there was a desire in Congress for it to be reformed. It's been reformed, and now I think it's just a matter of it being introduced as a bill to be passed. On the other hand, the GSP is now the subject of congressional concern, and people want it to be reformed in some way. So I don't see the GSP getting renewed until Congress takes up substantive consideration reforming it. I think that's all the time we have for questions. If you have any additional questions after today's webinar, and if you emailed us questions that we weren't able to get to, you can either contact your current Thompson Hine lawyer, or if you don't have a Thompson Hine contact, you can contact either me or Joyce with your questions, and we can discuss the options to address your needs. If you did ask questions, Joyce and I would be happy to contact you with your permission after the program this week. Finally, if you are seeking CLE for today's program, that tracking code again is 2020 election. If you want to be kept current on trade issues, we invite you to visit the International Trade Group's blog called Smart Trade with 1 T. When you go to that website, you can subscribe, you can enter in your email and have updates on trade policy pushed out to you. Finally, our next webinar in the series will be on insights into environmental shifts, which will take place next Tuesday, January 26th at 2 p.m. I want to thank everyone for your participation. We hope you enjoyed it. Enjoy the rest of your day, and most of all, be well. Take care.